So that's actually a really good question. I think sort of the smart city movement came out of this sense that cities weren't doing a good job keeping up with private industry, right? You have these tech companies that, Amazon, Google, right, where stuff shows up at your doorstep an hour after you order it, right?
Right, sure.
And then in the civic space, it takes 6 months to, get a permit or something like that in some cases, And so I think it was this realization that we could do better and we could leverage some of the technology that's already been developed for, private companies.
Got it.
The cloud computing, the platforms, the connectivity, right? The speed of web access, the apps, right? Everybody's got a cell phone. How
Sure.
do I access my government in the same way I access Amazon or Uber or whatever? And I have to clarify that I've heard the people who push back on that concept, and they say, if I hear one more time that city government needs to work like Amazon, and they're going to shoot somebody or whatever. Well, I think it really does. Not in the sense that you need it to be like a business that earns
Sure.
money like Amazon,
Sure.
right? But in the sense that Amazon spends a lot of time thinking about their customers, right? And goes to their customers, brings their service to the customer, right? And whatever level that is. And I think cities need to do that too, right? So we have, all these functions that cities provide from, paving your streets to permits, whatever. We need to think more about the customers and do customer-focused design and come to the customer with those things. So that's one piece of what drives the smart city, I guess the need for a smart city. Right?
Well, so let me ask you a question, because I so often hear people say we're doing the smart city initiative, and that means they're dragging fiber down the street, or they're just trying to be more
it's one
connected.
of my favorites.
Well, it's an expensive infrastructure thing that I feel like is kind of almost arcane at this point. I mean, don't get me wrong, everyone loves fiber, but I mean, so where do you really see that going over the next 3, 4, 5 years? I mean, are you talking smart city on decision making, or are you talking smart city on just like being more connected?
So it's a little bit of both. So, we started researching our smart city program here at Redlands about a little over a year ago.
Okay.
And it started from actually grant writing. So when you write grants, you tell a cool story about the project, right? And you try to describe what you're going to deliver for the community if this project gets funded. But sometimes it's difficult to also tell sort of the specifics about why this project is needed. Right?
Sure.
Let's say you're going to put a bike lane project in, and you can design this awesome bike project that's going to do all these great things for the cyclists, and it will. But how do you explain why you chose to put it on street X instead of street Y, right? That's a data question. You need, traffic counts and bicyclist counts and all these other pieces of the puzzle to tell that story. And so we started looking at, okay, we want to be competitive on these grant applications. We need that data. And that turned into how do we collect the data, how do we store it, how do we analyze it, which then turned into a smart city initiative, right? So it's sort of a little of both. You have, aging infrastructure that's difficult and expensive to maintain and expensive to replace, honestly, right? And you have, these financial challenges coming out of the recession and things like that. And so people started looking around saying, maybe if I did some analytics, maybe if I mapped this in a certain way, or if I built the right kind of database, I could figure out how to make my money go farther, right?
Sure.
And I can deliver the services that, going back to the Amazon concept, I can deliver that user-centric service in a cheaper way, or maybe make those dollars go farther and still deliver on the premise.
Well, and it's interesting that you say that, because, I was just listening to a podcast the other day, and they were talking about Amazon said something to the extent of they wanted to be the most customer-centric company in the world.
Right.
And I feel like they've really done that by, they're very product-oriented, but it's amazing how everything that they do is designed on helping deliver XYZ as fast as possible to your door, giving you that really great customer experience. I think it'd be really interesting seeing if cities could figure out a way to start delivering projects in sort of the same way, giving access to permits in a similar way, rather than, having to come in, stand in line for an hour, and then it might be approved in 6 weeks.
Right. Well, so there's a number of really sort of good, solid reasons why some of those things take a long time, right? We have a permitting process because behind that is a sort of general planning process where we've said we don't want certain kinds of buildings in certain kinds of places, and there's good reasons. There's health concerns, right? There's making sure the transportation network is functional, making sure we can deliver water, right? And so we have to sort of, those are big, expensive infrastructure projects, and you've got to plan them, 10, 20, 30 years out. To make that work, you then have to sort of manage where people put certain pieces of where do you build houses as opposed to where you put your warehouses, right?
Right.
And so in order to make sure that process, that well-planned process gets carried out over those 10, 20, 30 years, you have to sort of slow down the permitting process to a certain extent to give engineers and the city council, whatever, time to review those things and make sure that they fit in with the plans that the community has established for itself. So there's some good reasons for things to sort of slow down or be careful with it.
Sure.
But at the same time, there's a lot of opportunity to, okay, let's get this connected. You should probably be able to apply for your permit online, right? That'd be awesome.
Right.
And that's something that we're working on.
Well, and I think it might be more gratifying to the end user if they could submit it online and then they got notification updates when it moved around inside the building. Because there's probably a lot of stuff happening on that permit over those 6 weeks, but it's stuff that they don't see. And so it's not a gratifying process. And so if you could figure out how to make that part connected, that'd be a really interesting kind of smart, a piece of the smart city.
No, you're 100% spot on. I think you've hit the nail on the head with that. So it's really interesting. For example, city has an app. Most cities have an app where you can report, roadkill, potholes, water leaks, whatever, right? It's interesting, though, what happens on the back end with that. So a lot of times you'll submit a report, right? You'll take your picture, you'll submit your report, and then you think nothing happened. Well, something did happen. It's exactly what you're talking about, right? It went to a staff member who went out and took a look at it, right? Because then they're going to come back, and then we've got to figure out the funding mechanism. Procurement in cities takes time. We don't want people just spending the public money willy-nilly, right? So there's a whole process, and it moves through the departments. What we don't always do a good job with is coming back to the resident and saying, hey, we actually did solve the problem. Right. So we fixed the pothole. But maybe they didn't know that it got fixed, right? And so we don't always get credit for all of that sort of complex process that goes on the back end, and that's another good reason for...
Well, and I think this is where kind of comparing cities to Amazon is actually a really good comparison, is how do you make that complex seem easy? Because think about the logistics and the supply chain management that Amazon has running in the background. I mean, it was such a big deal that they built their own server farms so that way they didn't have to outsource it and developed an entirely new way of like cloud computing. So
you should trademark that, make complex seem easy. I think that's exactly right. So he's probably beat you to it, right? But I think that's exactly what smart cities is all about, right? It's taking this complex process of sort of civic governance, and how do you make that accessible and simple so that your average person doesn't have to be a government expert in order to access the services that are provided. It's interesting you mentioned, wanting to come back to the idea of laying fiber. I think it's nuts. Right, so there's a lot of things that cities are really good at, right? Really good at planning and land use management and civic organization, these kinds of things. We're not an ISP in most cases. A few cities are, but it's kind of interesting, So I won't name names. I don't want to call anybody out, but there's one city in particular that, as you go to smart city conferences and things, has stood out as they're sort of the leader in the fiber space.
Sure.
I actually got a chance at a conference to talk to the guy that's running the project, and he told me, I don't know if we could be called a leader, so we don't have a funding plan. We haven't rolled the fiber out yet, and we're not quite sure what we're going to do with it yet. This is the city that's on the cutting edge of municipal fiber. And it's like...
That sounds like the trailing edge of...
Yeah.
Well, but then the real question to me is, it seems like the way that they would truly be smart is then to ease the permitting process for the ISPs that are already running this, make it easier for them to put fiber, copper, whatever in. Yeah. And that way it's being privately funded and it's not coming off, a tax dollar to lay a connection.
Yeah. And it's interesting. So on the small cell, on the wireless side, that debate's raging right now. The governor just vetoed a bill that would have said exactly that. Wireless carriers, you can come into a city and kind of do what you want to a certain extent. There were some limitations on it still, but not as many as cities sort of individually put on the process. Sometimes for good reason, sometimes not. But that is a raging debate, and you have lots of people on both camps, and the governor, got caught in the middle of this last one and ended up vetoing the bill, and some cities are celebrating, some maybe not, but
interesting.
There's a trade-off between, I think, what private companies have their shareholders at the heart of what they're trying to do, whereas city government has, 70,000 residents in the case of Redlands that are sort of on the line here. Right. And so I think we all want there to be cell coverage. Verizon, AT&T, whatever, they want cell coverage in the city, and city government wants cell coverage in the city, and residents want cell coverage in the city. But it's how do you do that in a way that doesn't, take advantage of public infrastructure that maybe has been put in at citizen expense, right? Or that doesn't overburden the companies with, permitting requirements that don't make sense. And so it takes a lot of time to figure that out, which goes back to sometimes there are good reasons that cities do things slowly, and sometimes we can fix those things. So it's a kind of an interesting space to work in.
Well, and the part that's interesting, so especially for here in Redlands, most of downtown is already fiber run. So why would you spend, millions and millions and millions of dollars to run it again.
Yeah. And sometimes there's competition reasons, like, right, you want to give, low-income residents a choice or something like that. So there's some of those arguments. I tend to think that, at least here, you're right? FiOS is already out there. There's, Comcast, there's others that have already achieved that. And I'm happy to sort of work within that infrastructure, at least for now, because we have so many priorities. How do you pick and choose? And if that's sort of maybe partially handled, and maybe it's not perfect, but there's opportunities for, let's go figure out the sensor side or the database or something and not try to get into that yet. Well,
and I think when it comes to that, well, not to go down the fiber side too much, but when you start talking about cell coverage is so inexpensive to deploy. That's really become kind of like your last mile piece to replace fiber.
Right.
And so if you look at a lot of developing countries, they're not running actual lines anymore. They're running a cell tower, and that's how their citizens are getting low cost internet delivered to everyone.
Yeah. Well, or you got the Google balloons, I think it is.
Right.
Project Balloon, is it, that that's flying in Puerto Rico, right? Mm-hmm. So there's all kinds of options like that, and it's interesting because companies like Google Fiber are doing the last mile through RF or something like that. So part of what we do in the smart city space is we try to look at these trends as they come down, and we try to figure out where does it make sense for a city to invest, and where does it maybe not make as much sense.
Right.
And when you have potential for 5G, and we've got DSRC radios for connected vehicles, and you've got the fiber that the private companies have already laid. Where does the city fit into that mix? And, I think it's an open question at this point. I wouldn't rush out to spend money on it, but I'm also not saying we're never going to do it, right?
Right. Well, it seems like you'd be a lot more selective about it, or encourage the private sector to, in order to do this project over here, you need to help get this to the low income areas or something, where that way you can kind of leverage the, the power of the city, as it were, to help make sure everyone's treated a little bit more equally there. You were saying that the city was having a problem collecting data.
Right.
So what methods are you using to collect data right now, so that way you can make data-driven decisions?
So in a lot of cases, the data is collected, but nothing happens to it, right? And partly that's because we don't digitize it. Okay, so work orders are a good example. So in your typical work order situation, you have a request to fill a pothole that comes in from a resident, right? They're going to probably come in and make a request over the counter, or they're going to call customer service, and they're going to...
Somebody actually comes in and reports
that happens, yeah.
Oh, sure.
Right?
Sorry.
We have this whole one-stop permit center here in Redlands, right? When people come in and they, it's basically full-service customer service, right? That's the idea. So, yeah. Or people can call in, people can, use the 311 app, whatever. There's a number of different ways. But somebody will take in that request, validate that there's actually a pothole out there that needs to be filled, but essentially to get that done, you fill out a paper form, and that paper form gets handed to a work crew that's then going to go out and fill the pothole, and then, check some boxes on the paper form that say we did this, bring it back in, and it will get, maybe get entered, most likely get stuck in a file drawer, right? That's sort of the traditional approach to how you do this for the last 100 years or whatever, right? So what we are building now, here in Redlands, we have the benefit of being next door to Esri, and so we have a great working relationship with them, and they have a piece of technology where you have a mobile app that connects to that 311 system, and so people can report, hey, there's a pothole, take a picture of it. That data actually gets filed in a database. Somebody will still look at it and validate it, and it will still get sent out to a work crew, but now it's going either through email or straight into a work crew's mobile app, and they'll get like a work list with the locations on a map, and they're going to go drive around, take care of them, take pictures of the filled pothole, and it gets pushed in reverse back out to the customer, and the entire thing happens digitally. But where it gets really cool is now you have a database. And so, one or two potholes, nobody cares. But you fill 1,000 potholes over a couple of years or whatever it might be, right?
Sure.
And now you can map those, and you can say, half the potholes we filled happen on these 3 street segments. Maybe it's time to go out and, actually repave those street segments from scratch.
Interesting.
Right? We're doing all this, we're spending all this money filling potholes. We've paid for a street now, let's do the right thing, right? So when we talk about making data-driven decisions, that's what we're talking about. But it starts with, you've got to pull in the data the right way, and you've got to have it in a digital database that you can run analytics against and, map it and find those kinds of, we didn't know we were spending a bunch of money on the same segment of pipe because nobody had it in the database, right? And, so that's kind of, and you see that all over the place, from, personnel management to the public infrastructure to, how we spend money in the finance department, right? It's all... If you track it, now you can measure it and start figuring out how to do it better.
It's interesting. Somebody used to tell me you inspect what you expect.
Yeah.
or something along
That's
those
what
lines.
they say. If you don't measure it, you can't fix it, right?
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
it.
Those things that get measured get changed. Well, that's a very interesting. I wouldn't have ever thought about it quite from that perspective. This street happens to have 500 of the 1,000 potholes.
Right.
Maybe we should just repave the street.
Right.
Or, let's figure out a way to redirect that heavy truck traffic around it so that way that street doesn't get destroyed. Or
so now you're thinking like a smart city guy, right? And that's exactly what we spend our time and effort trying to figure out, right? Is how do we do things like that? Like going back to the grant project example.
Sure.
One of the things I started doing when I came to the city was writing grant projects around transportation, bike lanes, and sidewalk improvements, things like that.
Are you responsible for the green lanes?
Maybe partly. We can talk about
right.
that offline. No. Depends. Do you like them or not?
Depends on if I'm riding my bike or not.
Good answer. Well, we're trying to encourage you to do that, right?
All right, yeah. It's not like I couldn't stand to ride.
Cut down on traffic too, right?
Yeah, exactly.
See, public service.
Not sure I feel about that.
But I mean, that's a good point, right? Where do people actually want to ride? And that's exactly what we didn't necessarily know when we go into these grant applications from a traditional perspective.
Sure.
We can design a really cool project that sort of on paper, here's a bike lane, probably makes sense to connect one. But where? Right? There's all those blocks in between, and where do riders really want to be? Where are they headed? Where are they coming from? What times of day? What kinds of traffic are they facing? All these different kinds of things. And until you put all that into a piece of software and start doing, data-driven planning analysis, you're really,
That feels about right.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, part of the reason part of what stemmed to that question is I'm picturing those people on the side of the road that are sitting there with like a little counter and they're just counting.
Yes.
And then, they're there for 3 days counting traffic.
Yeah.
And that's the data that we're driving these decisions off of.
Right.
And to me, it seems like you'd be far better placed to put a simple camera there that can count cars and traffic and, dogs crossing the street.
Yep.
And, it'll get a 180-degree view or 360-degree view of or from where that camera is.
Right.
And now you can start having like real true, maybe it only goes in for 2 weeks, but given 2 weeks of like actual data, you probably have a very good understanding of, what's going where.
Right.
And if you could plug that data into your database, it seems like then you could start making really good smart city decisions on, wow, that street's extremely busy.
Yep. You should come work for us, BJ.
No, it's making ideas up on the spot.
And you're one of 300 startups that have that exact same idea and that actually come and pitch to us all the time. Hey, we've got this new camera that does, machine learning, vision, whatever, and we can solve these problems for you. I'm like, yeah, get in line, right? There really are lots of them, and lots of them with really cool technology. It's kind of funny though on the video side. We've done that for a long time. It wasn't always sort of AI driven. Though it used to be that, you'd stand on the side of the road and check stuff off, and there's actually formulas for, okay, does that count as a cyclist if they're walking their bike, right? There really are, like, you talk to people who are experts on like traffic planning, and they're going to tell you, well, were they wearing a helmet? You should probably be collecting that information. Did they turn right? Did they turn left? Right? Like, there's more detail than just 1, 2, 3, right? It's not just your server on the numerals, just tick boxes, right? So yeah, stand on the side of the road and do it. Then sort of upgraded that to, well, let's put a video camera out there so now somebody doesn't have to stand in the sun and check boxes, right? Now we record it, and then somebody sits in an office and watches the video and then checks off the form, right? So we moved them off the street. That was step one.
A little safer, I guess.
Yeah, it's more comfortable, right? I mean, now you can sort of data warehouse it or whatever. But yeah, now absolutely we're getting into all this AI machine vision stuff where the camera is actually doing the counts itself. No one ever looks at the film. In fact, it's probably not even recorded. The camera runs live. Some piece of software sits in the back end and says, I'm pretty sure that's a human. I'm pretty sure that's a cyclist. Count, right? And
well, chances are that software is probably right 98, 99% plus of the time. And as a result, if it's close enough, you just cut down on person expense.
Right.
Well, and the other piece that seems really fascinating to me is I keep thinking about what could you do if you could plug all that data into like IBM Watson or some of the true like AI platforms.
Ahead of you.
I hate it when you're ahead of me. Well, so what if you could use Watson to tell you, hey, these streets should be repaved. Here's where you should cross connect everything. And now we're just having part of what makes it a smart city is thinking of the better questions to ask.
Well, and so you're 100% on the right track. So let me take it one step even farther, right? So we have this project where we're getting our streetlights connected, right?
Okay.
So now there's companies telling us, well, we can do better than that. There's lots of people who can let you communicate with your streetlights remotely. But what if your streetlights also communicated with Watson, which just bought, I think, the Weather Channel or something like that? IBM owns it.
Interesting.
Yeah, so now they're piping in local weather data, and they're saying, okay, it's cloudy right now, let's turn up the streetlights a little bit. Let's turn them up by 10% to help people get around, right? So there's all kinds of, there's this sort of evolving vision, I think, in the tech space that's sort of slowly seeping into smart cities that your technology really should anticipate you, right? So, like, it's one thing to, okay, Google, right, and I want to, check the weather or get driving directions or something like that. But what if I didn't ever have to ask for it? It was sort of there right ahead of when I needed it, right? Just-in-time information.
So interesting. So it seems like really your goal is to figure out how to help the city anticipate what people are wanting. And
yeah, so it's not so much telling people what they want. Like, everybody still has their autonomy and they still make decisions, right? But we're we want to be sort of one step ahead of them. So my ideal vision for like the 311 reporting system would be, you don't have to call in a pothole because you're never going to see a pothole. Because by the time a pothole started developing, the city utility trucks are outfitted with, motion sensing equipment, like the same stuff that's, the accelerometer on your smartphone, right? It could tell that it went over a bump at that point, and that gets logged. And when that gets to a certain level, whatever the cutoff point is, we get out there and we fill the pothole, and the citizen never had to think about,
was there a pothole or
was there a pothole, and can I tell the city about it? And so we've sort of, yes, reporting is a cool concept, but what if you didn't have to report it because we were one step ahead of you? So it's not, you haven't lost any decision-making capabilities, but we've gotten the infrastructure to the point where it's not something you have to worry about. It's sort of faded into the background to a certain extent.
Honestly, that's a fascinating idea because you have enough city vehicles that are probably driving every single city street, every single day.
Trucks, utility vehicles, PD. The private vehicles of city staff. Right? There's PD. There's 101 different options.
I mean, PD's probably hitting every street in the city every day, every 2 days.
Exactly.
There's no reason that.
And this is technology that already exists, right? There's a little bit of a capital outlay cost to it, so trying to figure out, what makes sense and for the size of the city.
Well, the reality is probably most of their cars are already outfitted with enough technology to make 95% of this happen, and so it would just be creating the logic around the logic and the reporting of it. So that way, immediately my mind went to some kind of like camera that just kind of scanned the ground for imperfections, but
they have those too. I mean,
some variation of that or an accelerometer where it's and even if it just got logged as well, that was an abnormally large hit. Well, if you can figure out in the future, hey, well, okay, that there's just a big dip there, and but the city worker can then, when they go out, review okay, there's a speed bump. We're never going to go back there and check it again because it's
we map that on the GIS system, so at some point, there's sort of the lines between what's physical infrastructure and what's a data question kind of blur together, right? And it all becomes data, or it's all infrastructure, or data is infrastructure, right? You get into sort of philosophical questions, but you're right. If you wouldn't even need a big data set about sort of the roughness of a street, and you could probably suss out what are potholes as opposed to what are sort of the normal imperfections of the pavement. And now you map them, and then you get, let's start predicting them so we know what kinds of streets tend to have potholes based on traffic volumes, weather, street conditions, whatever.
Well, then you get. Well, then the nice part is then that data starts really helping you drive budgetary decisions.
Exactly.
And now you're planning far enough in advance to know, hey, Orange Street's probably always going to be one of the most beat up streets in the city.
Right. Maybe
we should make sure we stay on top of that one so that way we're not getting potholes.
Right.
But then we keep working on all the ancillary streets just to kind of bring them up to...
So one thing we did here in Redlands when we did this pavement management project, everybody knows it as Paris, but we've repaved a large majority of the city streets, and part of what enabled us to do that is we took a look at what condition all the streets are in, right, mapped all that, and then ran some calculations on when is that street segment going to fail, when is this one going to fail, right, and the ones that are about to fail, like you get out there and fix them sort of proactively so that they don't drop down a level in their quality category, right? So we have something called Pavement Condition Index, PCI, right? And it runs on a scale of 0 to 100, which as 100 is like a perfect brand new street. 0 is the street's totally failed. They can back to dirt probably, right? So, and I'm not a traffic engineer, but that's the gist of it, right? And so what we actually did is we hired a company that did exactly what you were talking about. They put cameras and other sensors on a vehicle, drove the city, and gathered PCI data for every street in the city, right? This was, I think, 2012. We got all that data in. And then we put that into the GIS system so you could map the PCI of the entire city, right?
Interesting.
Then we developed what we called the pavement management plan, which said, okay, let's rank the priority of these streets in terms of what makes the best sense for the community and against cost. So if you're in front of a school or you're a main street that drives commerce for the city or whatever, there's all these different conditions, right? Had community input and all these things. okay, so now we have a sort of a hierarchy of what streets we think need to be done first, and we know which streets are failing. And then what we can do is it's a lot cheaper to take a street from, let's say, 85 to 95 than it is to take a street from, 50. So no, I'm mixing this up, but basically, once a street's failed, let's say it gets to 50 PCI, it's basically failed. You're going to have to replace it. So it doesn't really matter if it falls from, I don't know, 50
You might have to grind it down. You might have to redo the entire bed.
You're going to have to anyway.
Right.
Once it reaches a certain point, you're going to have to anyway. But it's a lot easier to do, the 85, 90-ish% and keep them there. It's cheaper to keep them there than it is if they fall to 50 to bring them back. Right?
Interesting.
So you map the whole city.
So what you're saying is maintenance is cheaper than...
Yes. That's exactly
it. Miracle.
That's exactly it, right? And so the whole pothole conversation starts to become, okay, we know where potholes are happening. We also know how much it costs to improve or repair certain portions of the street, and we know how much potholes cost to fill. So now it becomes an entirely data-driven process where we say, okay, we know how to maximize our street dollars to get the best quality of streets possible for these dollars.
Interesting.
Right?
How many potholes do you think you guys are filling in a year? I'm just curious.
I don't know, but I know the number's gone dramatically down. Because we've almost replaced 2/3 of city streets. Were replaced or repaired, right? So they're all in good condition, and it's a lot cheaper to keep them that way than it is to sort of bring them up to that speed. So we made an investment in getting them all up, and now we have a plan for keeping them that way. Right?
That's really interesting because that's again, it goes back to it's like by maintaining your car, making sure your oil's changed, making sure your tires are inflated.
Exactly.
Your car is going to last a lot longer, and you're going to have a lot less unforeseen issues. You're going to have a lot less, chances are your transmission's not going to go out if you've hit all your service intervals, that kind of thing. And so that's really neat seeing a city actually applying those same kind of principles towards, being proactive in, proactive in planning versus we're just going to let it break and then we'll fix it eventually.
But it's the perfect perfect analogy for what smart city means, right? So you gather a bunch of information and you don't have to guess at how to spend the money. You can run the calculations and you can come up with, okay, there's some input, right? So the council will tell us, okay, we prefer these kinds of streets, or these are where community members have the most interest or the most use, whatever it might be. So they'll define sort of the parameters that you're working with, but inside those parameters, it becomes purely a data-driven decision, right? And
Interesting.
You run the calculations. You have this matrix that the council or the community has established. You run the data within that, and you always know, given these parameters, how to maximize the dollars to achieve that goal, right? And you can do that. It doesn't have to be streets, right? The same thing applies to sidewalks or bike lanes or the IT infrastructure or the budgeting process. Any of it really becomes that kind of a data problem.
So really, I feel like what I'm hearing you say is that this is much less about putting in whiz bang. It's less about the app, and it's less about it's more about the overall the citizen experience, and also it's almost more about the business intelligence that you gain out of collecting all that data.
Yeah.
And so you can now start having the city manager who can make decisions based off of a dashboard on the wall versus that feels right.
Right.
And so if you can actually make a decision based off of, that makes sense, that makes sense, that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Now you're moving forward in a positive manner.
So I think it's sort of half and half. So that's a big piece of sort of how we got into the smart city conversation. But then what you get out of that is, yes, you have this awesome infrastructure. We've got all these paved streets or whatever the case might be. The same thing, water pipes, whatever, right? But the other side of that is you can now explain to the public why certain things were done as opposed to other ones. So you will always in any city have people who come and say, why did my street get paved? Why isn't my water line repaired? Why don't I have a sidewalk in front of my house? And those are all really great questions. Unfortunately, no city has unlimited resources. So there are always going to be trade-offs like that. But if you're using a data-driven approach that's been vetted by the community, that you get buy-in from the council, the community, the executive staff that say, yes, we like this matrix, this approach, and then you apply that approach, then when you get those kinds of questions from the community, it becomes a much more straightforward conversation.
It gives you something to point to.
Yes.
So now you can...
We held hearings, we got community input. This process, we took our time to vet the process, and now we're applying the process, and your street's going to get done in a year when the data says that it's cost effective to do your street. And we've found that... You're
still at an 85, we're going to let you get to an 80, and we'll bring you up to 95.
Exactly. And people are like, oh, okay, great. Whereas, maybe before it was, okay, well, we didn't have the money to do your street because we're sort of focusing on downtown. Well, why downtown? Well, because, right, and now you have to sort of philosophically justify your decisions, and it's much harder to do, right? So it was so there's that sort of conversational piece, but there's also, we have this great open data portal, and a lot of cities are doing this where, what if, again, anticipating the citizens, what if we put that information, we make it publicly available, right? So we put that data on the website, and anybody can go and look anytime at the map and say, oh, I see they just did that street last year. I get why they're not doing it this year, right? Or
well, so it seems like having a really clearly articulated, easy to read, and easy to digest, explanation of what's on the map would be really, really awesome. And then you can basically just start heat mapping the map, showing, here are the pipes that we're replacing. Here are the roads that we've replaced. Here's, and here's why we've made these decisions. This pipe made it from 100 to 75 and it's leaking, so we need to replace it right away. Or
no, that's exactly it. And I think that's where, so we started this conversation talking about sort of design-oriented civics, right? This Amazon concept of how do we build to our users. And so now you've achieved that, right? So you've taken their input in terms of what they want. You've used data to figure out how to most effectively get that. You've shown them what they've gotten for their money. That's design thinking on a city scale, right? That's a smart city.
Well, I love the fact that there actually can be feedback on it. So that becomes a lot more, I'm a lot more likely to report that there's something wrong if I know that A, something's going to be done about it.
Yep.
And then somebody will let me know when something's been done about it.
Feedback breeds feedback.
Well, it gives you that closed feedback loop. And so that's how so for us, we run a lot, we do IT, and so we have a lot of closed loop systems. And so all of our feedback has to go back and forth through the system. So that way the customers are alerted when we worked on something. People have to be kept in the loop, because if they're not, then they just sit there wondering, did I do something?
Well, and it's going to be the same thing. So we haven't quite gotten there, I think, at the smart city conversation. It's kind of funny. Almost before there was a smart city, there was a sort of smart city 2.0. But in my mind, the smart city 2.0 is really, it's exactly what you're talking about. So when you work with your customers, they really wouldn't pay you very long, I imagine, if they said, hey, BJ, we've got this problem we want you to fix, and you fixed it but didn't tell them it was fixed, right? Or you fixed it your way, and they said, well, I'd really like if we could change these settings, configure this switch this other way. Yeah, that's nice. We have this sort of policy. We're going to do it this way, right? They're going to go find somebody else who's going to do it the right way, right? Do what they actually are paying for, right? Well, you have the same thing at the city level. So, we do these planning processes, right? But sometimes they're not as accessible as you'd like them to be, and it's going to depend on the community, right? But you might have, working mothers who can't make it to council to have the discussion about the bike lane at 4 p.m. on a weekday, right?
Or people that are working that can't make it to council meeting at 4 p.m.
And there's no way for you to sort of in the physical world reach all those people. It's just not going to happen, right? You have seniors who have their hours, and millennials with their hours, whatever the case might be. So what we're trying to do is let's take that process and sort of extend it online. So we can build this online community a la Facebook, right? Or something like that, where people can show up at City Hall or talk to the Permit Center folks if they want to, or they also have the option to giving just as valid input through the app or through the web page.
Sure.
And become part of the process. And so now what you get is you've sort of enabled that equitable access. So it doesn't matter what your station in life or your career situation or whatever, you can still have input on, hey, the app's going to give you an alert that the city's planning on potentially, putting a bike lane or repaving your street or doing pipe in your community or whatever. And you're like, oh, well, I actually care about that. It's happening on my street. Let me get on and thumbs up, thumbs down, leave a comment. Hey, can you keep my driveway clear because I got a doctor's appointment, whatever. And we can start incorporating this sort of individualized Amazon-style feedback, right? This individual city delivery of city services.
Well, it seems like a really interesting. I mean, you already have YouTube Live or Facebook Live. Right. I mean, you can do a lot of that. But then, like what you said about, hey, could you make sure to keep my driveway clear that morning? Because if you could figure out a way to grab that information,
right,
and then actually make sure that the people that are doing the street work, were aware of it. Hey, 1, 2, 3, 4, any one street. Make sure to keep that address clear. In the morning so they can go to work.
Well, and so we already do things like that, but it's like a labor-intensive, very manual process, right?
So it goes back to what you said about the work order. Right now, somebody's filling out a piece of paper and it's showing up. Whereas, if in their, the city truck they had an iPad or whatever, a tablet of some sort that just said, make sure you keep this street clear. This, here's how you do it.
You map it, and everybody sees the same map, and there's no conflicts, and that's exactly it.